The bus came through those gates just as the sun was thinking about rising, and inside sat 23 German Red Cross nurses who hadn't said a word to each other in what felt like hours, because what do you even say when you have no idea what's waiting for you on the other side? Erica Schneider was 24 years old, and she pressed her forehead against that cold window glass watching the wire fences roll past in the gray Texas dawn. And she had seen things that would never leave her mind. She had worked field hospitals from the frozen hell of Stalingrad all the way to the blood-soaked beaches of Normandy. She had held dying men in her arms and watched the light go out of their eyes more times than she could count. But somehow in this exact moment she was more terrified than she had ever been in her entire life, because everything the Reich had drilled into her head about what happens when you get captured was about to be put to the test, and she had absolutely no clue what was real and what was just propaganda designed to keep them fighting. The other women whispered sometimes, asking questions nobody could answer. What will they do to us? Will they split us up? How long before they start interrogating us and trying to break us down? And one older nurse named Hilda Weber just sat there with her eyes closed and her lips moving in silent prayer, because she had already been through this. She had been captured at a field hospital outside Achenbach in February of 1945, and that was 3 months ago now. 3 whole months of being moved from one temporary holding place to another, never knowing what came next or where they were taking her. And now here she was in Texas of all places, deep in the heart of America, the absolute center of enemy territory. And the bus was slowing down, which meant this was it. The door opened with this hydraulic hiss, and cold air rushed inside, bringing with it a smell that made every single woman freeze in place, because it wasn't the smell they expected. It wasn't disinfectant or diesel fuel or the metallic scent of fear. It was the smell of breakfast, actual breakfast. Bacon frying in a pan somewhere, coffee brewing hot and strong, bread toasting until it was golden brown. And Erica breathed it in without meaning to, and her stomach twisted with a hunger she had been trying to ignore for months, because when was the last time she had eaten real bacon? Maybe 1943. Maybe even earlier than that. She honestly couldn't remember anymore. A voice called out in English with a thick accent, "Ladies, please step down and welcome to Camp Hearne." And the women filed off that bus slowly and carefully, like they were walking into a trap, because they expected guards with rifles pointed at them. And yeah, there were guards with rifles, but the rifles were just slung casually over their shoulders like they were bored, and the guards looked more tired than threatening, which was not what anyone expected. Standing right there beside the guards was a woman in an American Army nurse uniform, and she was black, and several of the German nurses just stopped walking. One of them gasped out loud, because this didn't make any sense at all. The Reich had taught them that black people were inferior and incapable of holding positions of authority or respect. And yet here was a black woman in a crisp military uniform holding a clipboard and clearly in charge of whatever was happening here. And Erica felt something crack inside her worldview right then and there. The American nurse asked if they wanted coffee and gestured toward a table where steam was rising from metal urns, and the German nurses looked at each other completely confused, because was this some kind of trick? Were they being tested to see who would break first and accept kindness from the enemy? Hilda stepped forward first because she had always been brave and her English was broken, but it worked well enough. "We are prisoners," she said, and the American nurse just nodded and said, "Yes, ma'am, you are, and prisoners get coffee," and she poured a cup and handed it to Hilda in real ceramic, not tin or anything cheap. And the coffee was hot and dark and smelled better than anything Hilda had experienced in years, and she just stood there holding it like it might disappear. The other nurses couldn't resist anymore, and they crowded forward reaching for cups. And sugar was offered, Actual real sugar, not the saccharine substitute they had been using in Germany since 1942. And Erica held her cup with both hands, feeling the warmth seep into her frozen fingers, and she took one small, careful sip, afraid it might be poisoned or drugged. But it was just coffee, really good coffee, American coffee. And standing right there watching them drink it was that black nurse with a slight smile on her face, not mocking them or being cruel. Just professional courtesy like this was completely normal, and Erica thought to herself that maybe everything the Reich taught them was a lie. The processing took most of the morning and started with medical examinations where the German nurses had to strip down to their undergarments while American medical staff checked them for diseases and malnutrition and injuries, and Erica stood on a scale and watched the needle settle at 94 pounds, and she was 5'6", which meant she had lost over 40 pounds, because before the war she had weighed 135, and the American doctor, who was this older man with gray hair and kind eyes, just shook his head and said through an interpreter that they would fix this, and she would eat well here. The women were given clean uniforms, not prison rags, but proper clothing made of sturdy fabric that was well stitched, marked with PW in large letters, but otherwise identical to what American personnel wore. And they were assigned to barracks that had real beds, not bunks crammed together, but individual cots with actual mattresses and wool blankets. And the barracks were heated, and there were showers with hot water that actually worked. Hilda whispered to Erica as they made up their beds that this cannot be real. This must be for show, for photographs or propaganda. But Erica didn't respond because she was too busy trying to understand why this camp felt less like a prison and more like a military installation where they just happened to be confined. But nothing, and I mean absolutely nothing, could have prepared them for lunch. The mess hall was this large wooden building that smelled like every good memory Erica had of her mother's kitchen before the war started. The smell of real food, meat and vegetables and bread, and they lined up with tin trays following the lead of other prisoners who were already living in the camp. And the line moved them past a serving counter where American soldiers in kitchen whites were scooping food onto plates. And Erica watched the woman ahead of her receive a portion of meat, actual real meat, a piece of chicken that was golden brown and glistening with fat. Then it was her turn, and the server was this young man with red hair and freckles, and he smiled at her and asked if she was hungry, and she nodded because she couldn't speak, and he placed a chicken leg on her tray, and then mashed potatoes, and then green beans, and then a thick slice of white bread with a pat of butter on top. And Erica just stared at that tray because this was more food than she had seen on a single plate since before Stalingrad. More food than most German civilians were eating back home right now. And she carried her tray to a long wooden table and sat down slowly like the food might vanish if she moved too quickly. All around her, the other German nurses were having the same experience. Some of them were crying quietly, and others were eating with desperate speed like they were afraid someone would snatch it away. And Hilda took one bite of chicken and had to put her fork down, and she covered her face with her hands, and her shoulders were shaking, and Erica reached over and touched her arm. And Hilda looked up with tears streaming down her face and whispered that her children were starving in Hamburg, and here she was eating chicken in Texas, and how was any of this right? Erica had no answer for that because she was looking around the mess hall and seeing American guards eating at nearby tables, the same food, the same portions, and this wasn't special treatment for propaganda purposes. This was just how Americans ate every single day, like abundance was completely normal and expected. For the first time since her capture, Erica felt something more disturbing than fear. She felt shame. Not shame for being captured, but shame for what the Reich had told her about America. They said Americans were weak and decadent, and that their society was collapsing under the weight of mongrel races and Jewish influence. But if that was true, then how did they have so much food? How could they afford to feed prisoners better than Germany fed its own people? The math didn't add up, and that realization was terrifying in its own way. The afternoon brought even more surprises when the German nurses were assigned to work in the camp infirmary because their skills were too valuable to waste. And when Erica entered the medical building, she stopped dead in her tracks because the shelves were stacked high with supplies, bandages and gauze and surgical instruments and medications. And in one refrigerated cabinet, there were rows and rows of penicillin vials just sitting there. Penicillin, the miracle drug that Germany had heard about but could barely produce. And here it was in quantities that seemed physically impossible, and the American head nurse, who was this stern woman named Margaret, showed them the supply room without any apparent security concerns and explained through an interpreter that they would help treat patients, mostly minor injuries and illnesses, and they would work under supervision, but they would be trusted. And that word hung in the air like something heavy. Trusted. Erica had been a nurse in the Wehrmacht Medical Corps, and she had worked under constant suspicion where every supply had to be accounted for, and every dose of morphine was logged and checked, and theft was assumed and punished brutally. But here the Americans were just handing them access to supplies that would have been worth a fortune on the black market in Germany, and it made no sense at all. That evening after dinner, which was beef stew and cornbread, and more food than Erica could finish, the women gathered in their barracks, and Hilda sat on her bunk holding a letter she had been allowed to write home. One page that would be censored, of course, but still a letter. And she asked the room, "What do I tell them? How do I explain that we eat better as prisoners than they do as free Germans?" Another nurse named Marta spoke up and said, "You tell them nothing because they will think you are collaborating. They will think you have betrayed the fatherland." But Erica said quietly that they had betrayed nothing. They were simply prisoners who were being treated according to rules they did not know existed. And one of the nurses mentioned the Geneva Convention and said the Americans follow it. They actually follow it like it matters. The discussion went on for hours, with some nurses clinging to the belief that this was all temporary, a trick, a way to soften them up before the real interrogations began, while others like Erica were beginning to suspect something more troubling, that maybe the Reich had lied about everything, that maybe the enemy wasn't what they had been told at all. Over the following weeks, the pattern continued like clockwork. 3 meals a day, every single day, medical care whenever it was needed, work that used their skills and gave them purpose. And yes, there were rules. They couldn't leave the camp, and letters were censored, and they had to wear the POW markings. But within those constraints, they were treated with something that resembled dignity and respect. The contradictions piled up daily in ways that were impossible to ignore. A guard sharing cigarettes during a break. The black nurse teaching them English phrases with patient repetition, never getting frustrated when they struggled. An American doctor asking about their training and nodding with genuine respect when they answered his questions. One afternoon in the infirmary, Erica was changing bandages on a German prisoner who had cut his hand in the workshop, and the man was agitated and angry, and he muttered in German that they are trying to break us. All this kindness is psychological warfare. They want us to forget who we are. And Erica taped the bandage carefully and said quietly that, or maybe they are just following their own rules, and those rules say prisoners are still human beings. And the man stared at her and said, "You have been corrupted." And Erica finished her work and stood up and replied that she had been fed, and there is a difference between corruption and finally seeing the truth. By summer of 1945, news began filtering into the camp about Germany's complete collapse, the surrender, the occupation, the discovery of the camps, the full unimaginable horror of what the Reich had actually done, and the German nurses sat in their barracks listening to radio broadcasts that were translated by interpreters, and some of them refused to believe it while others wept in recognition that they had served a regime capable of atrocities beyond anything they could have imagined in their worst nightmares. Erica listened in silence, thinking about the food and the medicine and the rules that were followed even when the enemy was defeated and utterly powerless. And she understood something that would take her years to fully process. The Americans hadn't treated them well because Germans deserved it, or because they were trying to win propaganda points. They had treated them well because Americans believed that was how prisoners should be treated. Period. End of story. It wasn't about earning decent treatment through good behavior. It was about a society that had decided certain standards applied to everyone, including enemies, including people they were actively at war with. When the nurses were finally repatriated to Germany in late 1945, they returned to a country in absolute ruins. Cities destroyed, families scattered, food scarce. Everything they had known turned to ash. And Erica stepped off the ship in Hamburg, carrying a small bag of possessions, and she had gained 30 pounds during her captivity. She was healthy and strong and unbroken. And her sister met her at the dock, and her sister was thin and hollow-eyed and dressed in clothes that hung off her frame like she was a skeleton. And they embraced, and Erica's sister whispered, "What was it like? Were you tortured?" And Erica pulled back and looked at her sister and said, "No, I was fed." And that simple statement contained everything: the contradiction, the shame, the revelation that the enemy they had been taught to fear had been more humane than their own leaders had ever been. Years later, when Erica had children of her own, they would ask her about the war, and she would tell them many things. But the story she told most often was about the smell of bacon on a cold Texas morning, about how she had expected cruelty and found rules instead, how she had expected starvation and found abundance, how she had expected her enemy to prove everything the Reich had said about them, and instead they had proven that everything the Reich said was a lie. The lesson stayed with her forever, and she passed it on to her children and grandchildren. That kindness is not weakness, that rules followed consistently are more powerful than any propaganda, and that sometimes the most devastating weapon is not a gun or a bomb, but a hot meal given freely to someone who expected none. Because violence you can resist and fear you can endure, but kindness from an enemy you were taught to hate, that breaks something inside you that can never quite be put back together the same way again. Maybe that was the point. Maybe that was America's real weapon all along. Not just industrial might or military power, but the simple radical act of treating even enemies as if they were human beings worthy of basic dignity and respect. And the Reich had tried to teach her to hate, but bacon and coffee and bandages and penicillin had taught her something more powerful: that humanity can survive even the darkest wars, and that sometimes in the ruins of everything you thought you knew you'd discover that the enemy wasn't who you thought at all. The real enemy was the lie you had been told about them from the very beginning.